Every word spoken in the dark eventually finds its way back into the light of day. Join us as we explore the haunting echoes of past mistakes and the powerful stories of people finding their way home. Hit that subscribe button now and let the journey truly begin.
The documents were signed on a Thursday. I remember because my son had a baseball game that afternoon, and I missed it. Sitting instead in a conference room 30 floors above downtown Chicago, watching lawyers argue over language that would change everything. Nobody in that room knew who I was. That was exactly how I wanted it. My name is Daniel. I am 63 years old. I have a wife named Carol, a son named Patrick, who is now 31, and a brother-in-law named Gregory, who has spent the better part of 2 decades trying to convince everyone in his family, including his own sister, that I am a disappointment. I should tell you something before I go any further. Carol knew I was comfortable. She knew I had investments, that I worked as a private financial consultant, that money was not something we needed to worry about. What she did not know, what nobody in her family knew, was the size of it, the real size of it. I had kept that number locked away like a second heartbeat, something I felt constantly but never spoke about, not because I was ashamed of it, but because I had learned very early in my life what money does to people who find out you have too much of it. My father taught me that. He built a small manufacturing company in Ohio, told the wrong people how well it was doing, and spent the last 15 years of his life watching those same people try to dismantle everything he had worked for. Cousins, business partners, a brother he trusted completely. I watched all of it happen from the age of 12, and I made myself a promise standing at his grave at 67 years old that I would never let the number define the relationships. I would know people for who they were before they knew what I had. Carol and I met when I was 34. She was 31, working as a hospital administrator in Naperville. I was living in a 2-bedroom apartment on the north side of the city, driving a 5-year-old Toyota Camry, wearing clothes that were clean and decent, but nothing that would make anyone look twice. That was deliberate. It had been deliberate for years by that point. We dated for 2 years before I told her the truth. Or a version of it. I sat across from her at a kitchen table and told her I had done well with investments, that my consulting work was more profitable than it appeared, that she would never have to worry about the mortgage or the children's education or retirement. Her eyes got soft, and she reached across the table and took my hand and said, "Daniel, I married you because you made me laugh at a party where I didn't know anyone. The rest of it doesn't change anything." I believed her completely. I still believe her. That is important to understand. What I did not anticipate, and what took me years to fully accept, was her brother. Gregory Harlan had built his father's regional logistics company, Harlan Transport, into something considerable. His father, a man named Edwin, who I genuinely liked and who passed away 8 years into our marriage, had started the company with 2 trucks and a handshake reputation in central Illinois. By the time Gregory inherited full control, it had grown to a mid-sized regional operation, several hundred employees, contracts with manufacturers across the Midwest. Gregory had taken that foundation and expanded it further, though if you asked him, he had built the entire thing himself from the ground up. He had a particular way of rewriting history that I always found fascinating. Not malicious exactly, but the kind of casual self-mythology that forms when a man spends too much time around people who are afraid to correct him. From our first meeting, Gregory sized me up and decided I was not serious. I was a consultant. I drove a modest car. I lived in a house that was comfortable but not impressive by the standards of the neighborhood where he had built his own home. He was polite to my face for the first few years, the way a man is polite to a minor inconvenience he expects will eventually resolve itself. Then, when Carol and I had been married for 5 years, and I showed no signs of becoming either more successful in his eyes or more willing to disappear, the politeness started to wear through. It was small things at first, comments at family dinners about the economy, directed at me with a particular smile that asked whether I was keeping my head above water. Questions about my clients, phrased to suggest he doubted I had any serious ones. Once, at Thanksgiving, he pulled Patrick aside. My son was 11 years old and told him that it was important to choose a career with stability, that creative fields and consulting were fine hobbies, but a man needed to build something real. Patrick told me about it that night, confused about why Uncle Gregory had said it. I put Patrick to bed and sat in the kitchen for a long time before I felt calm enough to sleep. Carol defended me when she caught it happening, but she did not always catch it, and I noticed over the years that when Gregory was at his most cutting, she would go quiet in a way that told me she was not entirely certain he was wrong. That silence cost me more than anything Gregory ever said directly. I want to be fair to my wife. She is a good woman. She had grown up watching her father defer to Gregory, watching her mother treat Gregory's opinions as the operating instructions for the family. She'd been shaped by that dynamic in ways she was not always aware of. I do not blame her for it, but I also cannot pretend it did not hurt. What I had not told Carol, what I had not told anyone, was that 9 years into our marriage, I had made the largest investment of my career, a private equity position, structured anonymously through 3 separate holding companies in a maritime shipping and logistics firm called Meridian Continental. The company had been undervalued for reasons that were partly cyclical and partly the result of a leadership transition that the market had misread. I had spent 2 years studying it before I moved. The position I took was significant. Within 7 years, as the company expanded into Pacific trade routes and secured 3 major federal contracts, that position had grown to something that I no longer talked about in ordinary numbers. The figure, as of last spring, was $11.4 billion. I kept working. I kept consulting. I kept driving a sensible car and living in our house in Naperville, and going to the same diner on Sunday mornings that Carol and I had been going to for 20 years. Patrick grew up, went to college, became an engineer, married a woman named Suzanne, who I think is wonderful. Life moved forward in all the ordinary ways, and underneath all of it, that number sat quietly, accruing interest, waiting. The Thursday, everything changed started with a phone call. Gregory called me directly, which he almost never did. He usually communicated through Carol, using her as a kind of telephone operator for whatever message he wanted delivered to me. When I saw his name on my phone that morning, I felt something shift in my chest. Not fear exactly, but the particular alertness of a man who recognizes the beginning of something. He was cordial on the phone. Formal almost. He told me that Harlan Transport was at a crossroads, that there were decisions to be made about the company's direction, and that he thought it was time for a family conversation. He invited Carol and me to dinner that Saturday at his house. He said his wife Margaret would be cooking. I told him we would be there. I hung up and sat with the call for a moment. Then I went to my desk and pulled up 3 separate files I had not opened in some time. I should explain something. Harlan Transport had not been doing well. Gregory had expanded aggressively into markets. The company had no infrastructure to service, had replaced experienced logistics managers with personal loyalists who told him what he wanted to hear, and had taken on debt to fund acquisitions that had not performed. The company was not in crisis, but it was bleeding. I knew this because I had been watching it for 6 years. Not with any particular plan in mind at first, but with the instinct of someone who understands capital and recognizes a pattern. 18 months ago, through the same holding structure I had always used, I had begun quietly acquiring shares in Harlan Transport. It was a private company, so the mechanism was different. Convertible notes to existing shareholders who wanted liquidity, a small secondary market that Gregory did not manage closely because he had never imagined anyone would want to accumulate a position. By the time Gregory called me that Thursday, I held 41% of Harlan Transport. Gregory held 44%. His mother held the remaining 15%, and she had told her lawyer 18 months ago that she intended to leave her shares to Carol. I sat at my desk with those files open and let myself understand, for the first time, what was about to happen. We drove to Gregory's house on Saturday evening. It was a large house in Hinsdale, the kind that announces itself from the driveway. Pillars, professional landscaping, a 3-car garage with the doors all closed. Carol was wearing a blue dress I liked. She had been quiet in the car, which told me she knew something was coming, but did not know what. Margaret opened the door before we knocked. She had the energy of a woman who had been briefed on a script and was committed to delivering her lines correctly. She hugged Carol, squeezed my arm, told us it smelled wonderful from the kitchen. Gregory came out of the study at the end of the hallway. He was wearing a blazer with no tie, which was his version of casual authority. He shook my hand. His grip had the deliberate firmness of a man who has read about handshakes in a business book. He kissed his sister on the cheek and held both her hands for a moment. looking at her with an expression that I can only describe as preparatory. We sat down to dinner. Margaret had made pot roast, something I genuinely enjoyed, and for the first 20 minutes, the conversation was the performance it always was at Gregory's table. His recent trip to a conference in Miami, a renovation project on the house, a story about a competitor who had made a foolish decision. He told the story about the competitor with the particular relish of a man who believes other people's failures are a form of personal compliment. I ate my pot roast and listened and did not say much. Then Gregory set down his fork and folded his hands on the table and looked at me directly. "Daniel," he said, "I'm going to be honest with you, because I think you deserve that." I looked back at him and waited. He told me the company was facing a transition. He used that word, transition, the way people use it when they mean something harder than they want to say. He told me that he had been approached by an investor group that wanted to take a controlling stake, that there was real money on the table, and that he needed to think about what was best for the family going forward. He looked at Carol while he said the word family. Then he looked back at me. "Part of that conversation," he said, "involves making sure everyone's interests are aligned." Margaret had stopped eating. Carol's hands were flat on the table. Gregory opened the folder that had been sitting beside his plate since we sat down. He slid 2 documents across the table toward me. The first was a financial summary. The second was a legal agreement. I looked at both of them without touching them. The financial summary showed a valuation of Harlan Transport at a number that was, in my judgment, about 30% below what the company was actually worth, even in its current condition, before any operational improvements. The legal agreement was a shareholder buyout offer. It was addressed to Carol. I looked up at Gregory. "The investor group wants a clean cap table," he said. "Carol's interest, once your mother-in-law passes, would complicate the structure. We want to buy that out now, at a fair price before things get complicated." "That's for Carol to decide," I said. "Of course." He nodded. Then he looked at me with something I had seen before, that particular expression that arrived when he was about to say the real thing. "But I want to make sure Carol has the right counsel on this. And I want to be honest. I've had concerns for a long time that her financial situation is not what it should be. I love my sister. I want to make sure she's protected." Carol said his name softly. "Gregory, I'm just saying what I've been thinking for years." He spread his hands. "Daniel, I don't know what your consulting practice actually generates. I don't know what your retirement situation looks like. What I do know is that my sister deserves security. And if she's sitting on an asset that could give her that security right now, I want her to understand that option clearly." The table was very quiet. I thought about my father at his kitchen table in Ohio. I thought about the cousins and the business partners and the brother who had smiled over Sunday dinner for years before he started the paperwork. I thought about Patrick at 11 years old being told by his uncle that his father had not built anything real. I looked at the documents on the table. Then I looked at Gregory. "I appreciate you being direct," I said. "I like to be direct, too." He settled back in his chair with the small smile of a man who believes he has already won. "I've been aware of Harlan Transport's financial condition for some time," I said. "I've also been concerned about the direction of the company under its current management." Gregory's smile stayed in place, but something changed behind his eyes. "I want to share something with you," I said. I reached into the inside pocket of my jacket. I had worn the jacket deliberately that evening, and placed 3 documents on the table. The first is a shareholder registry showing a 41% stake in Harlan Transport, held through a holding company called Blue Meridian Capital. The second is the certificate of incorporation for Blue Meridian Capital. The third is a letter from my attorney confirming that I am the sole beneficial owner of Blue Meridian Capital. I let Gregory look at the documents. I watched his face complete a journey I will remember for the rest of my life. "I have been a shareholder in this company for 18 months, I said. "I have not exercised any of the rights that come with that position because I was waiting to understand the full situation. The buyout offer you're describing, buying out Carol's future interest at a 30% discount to fair value to hand controlling interest to an outside investor group, is not something I'm going to allow." Margaret stood up from the table. I do not think she meant to. I think her body just decided to. Gregory was looking at the incorporation certificate. He picked it up, put it down, picked it up again. Carol had not moved. She was looking at me with an expression I could not read, and I want to be honest. That was the moment I was most afraid. Not of Gregory, of the look on my wife's face. "Daniel," Gregory said, and his voice had a quality in it I had never heard before. "How?" "I've done well," I said, "for a long time. I kept it private because I learned early that money changes how people see you, and I wanted to be seen clearly. You kept this from Carol. I kept the scale of it private. Carol knew I was financially secure. She knew I had significant investments. I looked at my wife. What I hadn't told her was the full number. Carol said nothing. "I want to make you an offer," I said to Gregory. "Not a hostile one. I have no interest in dismantling what your father built. But this company needs new management. It needs someone who will listen to the people actually running the logistics operations. And it needs to stop taking on debt for acquisitions that don't fit the core business. I am willing to bring in a management team and the capital to restructure properly. And I am willing to do that in a way that preserves your role in the company if you want one. What I am not willing to do is watch Carol's inheritance get sold at a discount to protect a deal that benefits you and no one else." The word inheritance landed in the room and stayed there. Gregory set the document down. He looked at his hands. Then he looked at his sister. Carol was still looking at me. She said, "How long have you known about the company?" 18 months since I took the position. 6 years since I started watching it. And you didn't tell me. "No," I said. "I didn't." She was quiet for a long time. Long enough that I heard a car pass outside on the street. Long enough that Margaret sat back down. Then Carol said, "You were watching out for us." It was not a question, but I answered it anyway. "I was watching out for us," I said. She nodded once, slowly, like something settling into place. Gregory looked between us. Whatever he had expected from this dinner, and I believe he had expected a great many things, it was not this. Not his sister nodding at her husband over documents that made the buyout offer look like a child's proposal. Not the arithmetic of it, the reality of it. The fact that the man he had spent 26 years measuring and finding insufficient was sitting in his dining room, holding 41% of his company. "The investor group," Gregory said finally. "Tell them the deal has changed," I said. "If they're serious about the company's future, I'm willing to have a conversation about structure. But the terms start over." He nodded. He looked like a man trying to remember how to operate his own face. Margaret asked if anyone wanted dessert. She had made apple pie. I said that sounded wonderful, and I meant it because the truth is I genuinely like apple pie, and the situation had resolved itself, and there was no reason the evening couldn't end on something good. The drive home was quiet for the first 10 minutes. Carol sat with her hands in her lap, looking at the road ahead. Then she said, 11 billion. 11.4, I said. She made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "All those Sunday mornings at the diner," she said. "I like that diner. Daniel. Carol." She turned to look at me, and in the passing streetlights I could see she was somewhere between crying and laughing, that uncertain edge between two kinds of overwhelmed. "Why didn't you tell me?" she said. Not Gregory. Me. Why didn't you tell me the whole truth? I thought about how to answer that honestly. "Because I needed to know who you were without it," I said. And then I knew, and it was better than I had hoped, and every year it got harder to bring up, because we had built something real, and I didn't want a number to become part of how we understood what we had built. She looked at me for a long time. "That is a terrible reason," she said. "I know," I said. "And also," she said slowly, "I think I understand it." She reached over and put her hand on mine on the gear shift. I turned my hand over and held hers. We drove the rest of the way home like that. There are things I would do differently. I want to say that clearly because I think it matters. The silence I kept was not entirely noble. Some of it was fear. Fear of becoming the number. Fear of losing the version of my life that felt most true. Fear of watching the people I loved rearrange themselves around a figure on a balance sheet. That fear was mine to carry, and I carried it in a way that was not always fair to Carol. What I know is this. Gregory called me 2 weeks later, professionally, the way he might call any significant shareholder. The conversation was careful and brief. A management consultant came in the following month. The logistics directors, who had been overruled for years, finally had someone listening to them. The company is doing better, not because of me specifically, because the people who understood it best were finally allowed to do their jobs. Carol and I went back to the diner that Sunday. Same table we always take, corner booth by the window. She ordered the eggs Benedict. I had the pancakes. We read different sections of the same newspaper, which is something we have done for 20 years, and which I hope we do for 20 more. She looked up at some point and caught me looking at her. "Stop," she said. "I'm not doing anything," I said. "You have that look," she said. "Like you know something." "I almost always know something," I said. She shook her head and went back to her newspaper, and I went back to mine. And the coffee was good, and the morning light came through the window, the way it always does, and that was enough. That has always been enough. I am 63 years old, and I have learned at some cost that the greatest inheritance you can leave anyone is not a number. It is the knowledge that someone chose to stay when they didn't know the number. That is the thing that cannot be manufactured or negotiated or purchased at any valuation. Gregory tried to buy it, in his way, for 26 years, and it was never for sale. The documents are still in my jacket pocket. I haven't put them away. Some mornings I feel the weight of them, and remember that Thursday, the conference room 30 floors up, the lawyers arguing about language, my son's baseball game that I missed. I should have been at that game. Some things you get right and some things you carry. That is the honest truth of it, and I have made my peace with the balance.